Let us pray. Father in heaven, as we begin this study, we ask that you will open our ears to hear and that you will open our eyes to see. We want to do your will. We want to know where we are in the course of history because we need to prepare for that glorious event, the coming of Jesus and the passing through the time of trouble. So we ask that you will be with us, that your Holy Spirit will guide our thoughts. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. In previous studies, we noticed that Matthew 24 has a dual fulfillment. The first fulfillment was in the events that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. The second application, or the second fulfillment, is when the events at the end of the world lead up to the second coming of Jesus Christ. However, a question surfaces now as we begin. Does Matthew 24 address the period between the destruction of Jerusalem and the events that lead up to the second coming of Christ? Or does Matthew 24 bypass the long period of Christian history between the destruction of Jerusalem and end-time events? As we have seen in a previous presentation, there is only one great tribulation divided into two parts, with a pause in between those two parts. The first part is from 538 to 1798 AD. It's the period of papal dominion. The second period is after the pause period ends, when the deadly wound of the papacy heals and the papacy behaves in the end-time events as it did in the past. So the question is, does Matthew 24 address both of these periods? In a certain sense, we noticed already that Matthew 24 does. However, Matthew 24 appears to bypass, generally speaking, the period of church history between the destruction of Jerusalem and end-time events. It seems to focus primarily on the events that will take place after the pause period ends. However, in this lesson, we are going to notice that as we examine the parallel passage to Matthew 24, in Luke 21 and verses 20 and 21, this period of church history is very clearly addressed. This becomes clear when we compare Luke 21 and verses 20 and 21 with Daniel 7:25, Revelation chapter 12 verses 6 and 12, Revelation 13 verse 5, and Revelation chapter 11 and verses 2 through 6. So we're going to take a look at all of these passages to see how they relate to one another. And we're going to see that Luke does have a strong focus on the period of 1260 years when the papacy predominated primarily in Europe. So Matthew 24, as we examined this chapter, after the sign of the abomination of desolation, has four sequential signs. The first is the destruction of earthly Jerusalem. That's found in verses 15 through 20 of Matthew chapter 24. Then we have a second period, which is sequential to the first, and that is a period of severe tribulation. That's found in Matthew chapter 24 and verses 21 through 28. Then the third sequential point that we find in Matthew 24 after the abomination of desolation are signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. And that's found in Matthew 24 and verse 29. Finally, the fourth point that we have, sequential to the previous three, is the shaking of the powers in the heavens and the appearance of the sign of the Son of Man and the second coming. We find that in Matthew 24 and verses 30 and 31. So once again, you have four sequential events after the abomination of desolation. You have the destruction of earthly Jerusalem, a period of severe tribulation, signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and finally the shaking of the powers of the heavens, and the appearance of the sign of the Son of Man, and then the second coming of Jesus Christ. However, when we look at Luke chapter 21, we find that perhaps there are only 3 sequential signs rather than 4. And Luke 21 is the parallel passage. Let's notice those 3 sequential signs that are referred to in Luke chapter 21, beginning with verse 20. The first is the destruction of earthly Jerusalem. We found that also in Matthew 24. That's found in Luke chapter 21 and verses 20 through 24. The second point, sequential point in Luke chapter 21, is the signs in the sun, moon, and stars. And that's found in verse 25. And then the third sign that you find in Luke chapter 21, the third event, sequential event, is the shaking of the powers of heaven and the coming of the Son of Man, which is found in verses 25 and 26. So missing in Luke 21, it appears, is the sign of the Great Tribulation. However, we must ask, is the tribulation sign really missing in Luke chapter 21? As we shall see, the answer is no. Luke simply describes the tribulation sign differently than does Matthew chapter 24. We're going to find that Luke describes this tribulation period as the trampling of the holy city by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, we need to notice, first of all, that one thing is very, very clear in the first half of Luke 21 and verse 24. And that is that the first half of this verse is describing the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman legions that led to the destruction of the literal city of Jerusalem, the literal temple, and the exile of the literal citizens of Jerusalem to all nations. So Luke 21 verse 24, the first part of the verse deals with the destruction of literal Jerusalem. However, the second half of Luke chapter 21 deals with a different Jerusalem. Actually, Luke 21 and verse 24, the last half of the verse, is transitional. It describes a trampling of spiritual and symbolic Jerusalem. It describes spiritual and symbolic Gentiles. And it describes a symbolic period. So in other words, we're dealing with a different Jerusalem, a spiritual Jerusalem, spiritual Gentiles, and a symbolic time period. Let's read Luke 21 and verse 24. It says like this, "And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Now you notice that the first half of Luke 21 and verse 24 says, "And they will fall," this is a literal Jerusalem, "by the edge of the sword, and be led captive into all nations." That is by the Romans. So now we find in the second half of the verse, "And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." And actually, I like the New Living Translation of the last part of the verse, where it says, "until the period of the Gentiles comes to an end." So what do we have here? What elements do we have here in the last half of Luke 21 and verse 24? We have Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until, this means that there's an ending point to the times of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles come to an end. So the times of the Gentiles have a beginning point and they have an ending point, although Luke does not mention the beginning or the ending point. We have to go elsewhere to find the beginning and ending point. In other words, Luke 21 and verse 24 speaks of two cities of Jerusalem, one literal and the other symbolic. It speaks about two tramplings of the city of Jerusalem, one literal and one symbolic. And it refers to two groups of Gentiles, one literal and the other symbolic. Lewis Weir, an Australian evangelist that lived primarily, his work was done in the 40s and early 50s, had a very interesting quotation that I want to share with you now. This is in his book, The King of the North at Jerusalem. This is a very important principle of prophetic interpretation. When passing over into the Christian era, there is an automatic transition from literal to spiritual Babylon, from literal to spiritual Jerusalem, from literal lands of Israel and Babylon to their spiritual antitypes. So up to the time of the stoning of Stephen, you're dealing with literal Jerusalem and you're dealing with literal Gentiles. Then, later on, after the establishment of the Christian church, you have the spiritual antitypes. Babylon is no longer literal. Jerusalem is no longer literal. Jerusalem refers to the Christian church, and the Gentiles refers to the papacy that persecutes God's people, as we will see in the course of our study. Now, when the second part of Luke 21, verse 24, describes the trampling of Jerusalem by the Gentiles, this is not referring to the literal city of brick and mortar. Jesus uses the word Jerusalem to refer to the people of the city. In other words, the trampling of the city in the second part of Luke 21 and verse 24 is dealing not with the trampling of a literal city of brick and mortar. It's talking about the people of the city that are trampled upon. I want to go first of all to a text in the Old Testament. This speaks about the first destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. And you're going to notice that Nebuchadnezzar took all Jerusalem captive. It says there in 2 Kings chapter 24 and verses 14 and 15, also he carried into captivity all Jerusalem. So did Nebuchadnezzar take the walls of Jerusalem and the temple of Jerusalem and the city itself into captivity? No, not the brick and mortar, it's the people. So once again, and he carried into captivity all Jerusalem, all the captains and all the mighty men of the valor, the 10,000 captives and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. So carrying Jerusalem into captivity means the people are carried into captivity. Jesus also considered Jerusalem, the word Jerusalem, to refer to the inhabitants of the city. Notice Luke chapter 19, verses 41 to 44. Here Jesus is coming down the eastern slope towards the Golden Gate of Jerusalem on the east side, and we find these words. Now as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace. He's not talking about the literal city of brick and mortar. He's talking about the people and their reaction to him. It continues, however, now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. Obviously, the physical city of Jerusalem would not know the time of God's visitation because it's a city. It has no conscience. However, when Jesus says, you did not know the hour of your visitation, he's talking about the people of Jerusalem. In Matthew 23, verses 37 to 39, once again, we find Jesus referring to Jerusalem as the people. So in the second half of Luke 21, verse 24, when it speaks about trampling Jerusalem, it's not talking about trampling the literal city of bricks and mortar. It's talking about trampling upon the people of the city. It says in Matthew 23, verses 37 to 39, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets." Obviously, the brick and mortar did not kill anyone. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children," see, here's the people, "your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you," still speaking of the city, "you shall see me no more till you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So Luke 21, verse 24, the last half of the verse, is not speaking about the trampling of the literal city of Jerusalem by the literal Romans. It's talking about a spiritual Jerusalem, the people that are being trampled upon by a power that is referred to as the Gentiles. So now I want you to notice a very interesting verse that we find in Revelation 11, verse 2, which is parallel to Luke 21 and verse 24. And I want you to notice the relationship between Luke 21, 24 and Revelation chapter 11 and verse 2 as well as verse 3. It says there in Revelation 11, verse 2 and 3, "However, leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot 42 months." You remember that we find in Luke 21 and verse 24 four elements: Jerusalem, trampling, Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles come to an end. You'll notice that Revelation 11 verse 2 has the same elements. It speaks of the holy city being trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, and then it gives us the period. It doesn't say until the times of the Gentiles come to an end. It says for 42 months. So the 42 months are the times of the Gentiles of Luke chapter 21 and verse 24. So I want you to notice the parallel between Luke 21, 24, the last half of the verse, and Revelation 11 and verse 2. You clearly have a parallel there, the same four parts. The holy city Jerusalem, trampling of the holy city Jerusalem, the Gentiles are doing the trampling, and the times of the Gentiles are the 42 months, and when the 42 months come to an end, the times of the Gentiles are finished. But then I want you to notice verse 3. Immediately after verse 2, where it speaks about the trampling of Jerusalem, Revelation 11 verse 2, we have another period that is mentioned, which is the same period expressed in different terms. It says there in verse 3 of Revelation chapter 11, "And I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth." So you'll notice that the 42 months of verse 2 and the 1,260 days of verse 3 are parallel. In other words, they refer to the same period. Now, we need to understand a very important principle in Bible prophecy, and that is that time periods in prophecy are symbolic. In other words, you apply the year-day principle. One literal day is equivalent to one literal year, which means that the 42 months are not literal 42 months. They actually are 42 months times 30 days each month, which is 1,260. So in other words, we're dealing with a 1,260-year period. That's the times of the Gentiles. That is what Revelation 11 verses 2 and 3 is referring to. So it says there in verse 3 again, "And I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days," that is years, "clothed in sackcloth." Now, this is a very important point that I'm going to share in the next couple of minutes. John wrote Revelation 11 verse 2 at the end of the 1st century. In other words, he wrote this around the year 95 AD. 25 years earlier, the literal city of Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Roman legions. In other words, the literal city of Jerusalem and the literal temple had already been destroyed when John wrote Revelation 11, verses 2 and 3. In other words, literal Jerusalem had been in ruins for 25 years, and its inhabitants had already been taken into exile to the many nations. Thus, Revelation 11, verse 2, cannot refer to the literal destruction of literal Jerusalem in the year AD 70, because John, in Revelation 11, verses 2 and 3, is speaking about a future desolation and trampling of Jerusalem. The literal Jerusalem had already been trampled and destroyed 25 years earlier. Now the question is, who are the Gentiles, and what is Jerusalem, or the holy city, in Revelation chapter 11 and verse 2? In a previous presentation, we saw that Jerusalem, during the Christian dispensation, refers to God's faithful church. And the Gentiles represent the enemies of God's faithful church. In other words, you're not dealing with literal Jews and you're not dealing with literal Gentiles. The literal Israel, or Jerusalem, represents the church, whereas the literal Gentiles represent the enemies of Christ's church. You can look at several Bible verses where this is proven. In Romans chapter 9, verses 6 through 8. I'll just mention these because we've studied them before. Romans 2, verses 28 and 29. Galatians 3, 26 to 29, where we find that if you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed. In other words, we are Israel if we are Christ's. John 4, 23 and 24, and John 8, 31 to 58 all show that those who are considered Israel or Jerusalem are the faithful people of God, the faithful church of God. The Gentiles are those who are enemies of God's faithful people. Now here's another important point. In Revelation 11 and verse 1, after the angel told John to measure the temple and those who worship in it, but not to measure the court, because the court was given to the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled. This is very interesting because immediately after the times of the Gentiles, you have the measuring of the temple. It can't be the literal Jewish temple because it was destroyed. So this must refer to the heavenly sanctuary. It must refer to the heavenly temple. When John wrote the book of Revelation, Rome had already destroyed literal Jerusalem and the literal temple, and Israel had already been scattered among all of the nations. This means that the temple in Revelation 11 verse 1 is not the literal Jerusalem temple. It must be the temple of the Christian dispensation, the temple in heaven. And the worshipers in that temple must not be people who are literally worshiping in heaven, but by faith they are entering the heavenly temple where Jesus is interceding for his people. In other words, we are to understand the temple is the heavenly sanctuary, and the church spiritually is the earthly reflection of that temple. Now, let's notice something else that is very, very interesting. Now, before I go into this next point, I want to make sure that the previous point is very, very clear. That is, you have the times of the Gentiles, and then you have the measuring of the temple. So you have the 42 months, or 1,260 years, and then after that, you have the measuring of the temple. Now, I want us to notice something else. According to Revelation 11 and verse 2, the trampling of the city occurred for a period of 42 months. We already noticed that. And this period, as we noticed, is also described as 1,260 days. Now, this links the 42 months of verse 2 with the 1,260 days of verse 3. In other words, they're the same period, 42 months, 1,260 days. But now we need to notice something even further. Even further, it links Revelation 11, 2 and 3, where you have the 42 months and the 1,260 days, with the 1,260 days of Revelation 12, verse 6, and the 42 months of Revelation 13, verse 5. So I want you to notice that Revelation 11 in verse 2 and verse 3 refers to 42 months and 1,260 days, but also Revelation 12, verse 6 refers to 1,260 days, and Revelation 13, verse 5 refers to 42 months. In other words, Revelation 12 and 13 amplify Revelation 11, verses 2 and 3. So summarizing, the 42 months are in Revelation 11, verse 2. The 1,260 days are in Revelation 11, verse 3. The 1,260 days are also in Revelation 12, verse 6. And the 42 months are also in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 5. So we have to study Luke 21, verse 24, the last part of the verse, with Revelation chapter 11, verses 2 and 3, with Revelation 12, verse 6, and Revelation 13 and verse 5. We have to link all of those together. Now, in order to understand Revelation 11, verses 2 and 3, we must not only go back to Revelation 12 and also verse 13, actually go forward to Revelation 12 and Revelation 13, but we also must go to the Old Testament roots of this particular prophecy. And the roots of the prophecy of Revelation 11, 2 and 3, as well as Revelation 12 and Revelation 13, are found in Daniel 7, verse 21 and 25, and Daniel 8, verses 11 to 13. In these verses, as we will notice, we're going to find a power, a little horn power, that tramples underfoot the temple of God and its true worshipers. This trampling of the temple and the worshipers in Daniel 7 and 8 does not refer to the destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity of the literal Jews at the hand of the Roman Empire, but rather to a rebellious little horn that introduced an idolatrous Christian worship that caused desolation after the breakup of the empire. Let's read Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25, where we find that this little horn blasphemed God, persecuted his people, thought he could change the law of God, and he ruled for 3.5 prophetic years. Let's read Daniel 7, verse 25. The little horn shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. So you notice here a little horn speaks pompous words against the Most High, persecutes the saints of the Most High, blasphemes the Lord, thinks that it can change times and God's law, and you have a time period. The saints are given into the hand of this little horn for time, times, and the dividing of time. Now, in order to understand Daniel 7:25, we have to look at the entire chapter, the sequence of powers in the entire chapter. If you notice, Daniel chapter 7 speaks of a lion. That represents the kingdom of Babylon. Then you have a bear, the Medes and Persians. Then you have a leopard, Greece. Then you have a dragon beast, the Roman Empire. Then the dragon beast sprouts 10 horns. That was the division of the Roman Empire in the year 476. The barbarians invaded the empire and they divided the empire into 10 kingdoms. And then after the empire is divided, it's completely divided by 476, then the little horn comes up among the 10. And the little horn then does what we read in Daniel 7 and verse 25. And then notably after this, you have the beginning of the judgment in the heavenly temple. Very similar to Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 to 3. You have, first of all, the trampling of the holy city for 42 months, and then you have the measuring of the temple. in Daniel chapter 7 and verse, actually the end of the chapter, you have the little horn ruling for 1260 years, times in the dividing of time, and then you have a judgment scene. The judgment begins. So let's continue then here. The lion is Babylon, the bear Medes and Persians, the leopard Greece, the dragon Rome, the 10 horns is a division of the Roman Empire, which is completed in the year 476. Then you have the rise of the little horn, and the little horn then rules for times, and the dividing of time. And after this, you have the judgment scene. And by the way, that judgment scene is mentioned in Daniel 7, 8, and 9, verses 13 and 14, verses 21 and 22, and verses 25 through 27. So you have this same sequence. The little horn, the work of the little horn, times the dividing of time, and then you have after that the judgment. In Revelation chapter 11, you have the same idea. You have the times of the Gentiles, and then you have the measuring of the temple. Now, a very important detail in Daniel 7 and verse 25 is that the little horn thought that it could change God's law. You know, and the Gospel of Matthew calls this the abomination of desolation, interestingly enough. Now, what was the greatest abomination that was being committed among God's people before the first destruction of Jerusalem? If you read Ezekiel chapter 8, verses 14 through 16, you have there the greatest abomination that was being practiced in the city. And that was that the leaders were worshiping the sun. They had their backs to the temple of God, and they were worshiping the sun. In other words, the little horn, during the 1260 years, during the times dividing of time, or 42 months, whichever way you want to express it, in some way thought that it would change God's holy law. And as we look at history, we know how this was fulfilled. The papacy claims to have changed the Sabbath to Sunday as the day of worship, the day of the sun. Now, Daniel 8 further amplifies the nefarious work of this little horn power by specifically saying that the little horn trampled on the sanctuary and trampled the host. That's Daniel 8 and verse 13. Which is language very similar to Revelation 11, verses 2 and 3. Now, Daniel 8 describes the little horn in two stages. The first stage is pagan Rome. It conquers horizontally. Then this little horn morphs, and it attacks heaven vertically. In other words, it becomes a religious little horn. The first one is a political horn that is conquering geographically. The second, same little horn, morphs, and now it meddles with the Lord in heaven. It tries to take away the ministry from the prince of the host. It persecutes the saints of the Most High, and it tramples on the sanctuary. The first stage is in Daniel 8, verse 9. It says, "And out of one of them came a little horn," this is the same power of Daniel 7, "which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land." See, it's extending geographically. But then suddenly this little horn morphs into a power that attacks heaven and the saints that worship by faith in the heavenly sanctuary. It says there in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 10, "And it grew," the little horn, "up to the host of heaven, and cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground, and trampled on them." See, here's you have the trampling of Revelation 11, verses 2 and 3. "He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him," that is by the little horn, "the daily sacrifices," the word sacrifices doesn't belong there, it's the daily, "was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily. And he cast truth to the ground. He did all this and prospered." Verse 13, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, How long will the vision be concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation?" Interesting, the transgression of desolation. "The giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot." Do you see the little horn is doing the same thing that is referred to in Luke 21 and verse 24, the last half of the verse, and Revelation 11, verses 2 and 3. So you have to connect Revelation 11, Luke 21, verse 24, as well as Daniel 7, which gives us times, and the dividing of time, and Daniel 8, where you find the little horn trampling the host, which are God's people, and trampling the sanctuary. You know, it's no coincidence in Daniel chapter 8 that after the period that the little horn tramples on the host and on the sanctuary, then we have the cleansing of the sanctuary, which is the judgment. Interesting. In each of these scenes, in Revelation 11, verses 2 and 3, after the times of the Gentiles, you have the measuring of the heavenly temple. In Daniel chapter 7, after the little horn performs its work for times the dividing of time, you have the judgment scene. In Daniel chapter 8, after the little horn tramples on the sanctuary and tramples on the host, then you have the cleansing of the sanctuary, the judgment. Very interesting. Now, we must also link Daniel 7 and 8 with Revelation 11 and 13. So let's do that. In Revelation chapter 13, we'll deal with that first, Revelation chapter 13, you have the same sequence of powers that we noticed in Daniel chapter 7. We don't have time to go through the chapter in detail, but I want to mention just a few things that the beast does in Revelation chapter 13. By the way, if you notice verses 1 and 2, it says that the dragon represents Satan working through the Roman Empire because the dragon tried to slay the child when he was born. Satan did that through Herod, a ruler of the Roman Empire. So anyway, the dragon in verses 1 and 2 of Revelation 13 gives his seat, his power, and his authority to the beast. And then the beast performs its work for 42 months. I want you to notice the sequence of powers in Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, and then we'll read verses 5 and 7. It says there in Revelation 13, 1 and 2, that you have a lion, you have a bear, you have a leopard, you have a dragon beast. That dragon beast, according to Revelation chapter 12, has 10 horns. And then the dragon beast that has 10 horns, which represent the 10 divisions of the Roman Empire, then you have the beast that comes from the sea that rules for 42 months. Let's read verses 5 through 7 so that you can see the connection between the little horn of Daniel 8 and Daniel 7, Revelation chapter 11. All of these passages are connected. It says in Revelation 13, verses 5 through 7, speaking about this beast from the sea, and he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And he was given authority to continue for 42 months. See, there it is again. The beast, 42 months. The little horn, times the dividing of time. And we also found 1,260 days in Revelation chapter 11 and verse 3. So it says he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God. Same thing that the little horn did in Daniel 7. To blaspheme his name, his tabernacle. There you have the trampling of the tabernacle. And those who dwell in heaven. It was granted to him to make war with the saints. Same as Daniel 7 and 8. And to overcome them. And authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. So you have the same sequence in Daniel 7 as you have in Revelation chapter 13. In Daniel 7, it refers to times the dividing of time, whereas in Revelation chapter 13, it refers to this period as 42 months. Now, we must also connect Daniel 7 with Revelation chapter 12. See, we've connected Daniel 7 and 8 with Revelation 11 and 13. Now we need to make a connection between Daniel 7 and Revelation 12, and of course, all of the other passages that we've been discussing. As we have seen, Revelation 11 and verse 3 has a relationship with Revelation 12 verse 6, because both Revelation 11 verse 3 and Revelation 12 verse 6 mention 1,260 days. Even further, the terminology of Revelation 12 verse 6 shares common language with Revelation 12 and verse 14. And Revelation 12 verse 14 in turn has a connection with Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25. That is the time, times, and dividing of time. Now this might all be confusing, so let me just go through these different passages. Revelation 11, verse 2 and verse 3, and then Revelation 12, verse 6, Revelation 12, verse 13 and 14, and Daniel 7, verse 25, and we'll put it all together. First, Revelation 11, verse 2. Actually, verse 3. And I will give to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. Now, that's connected to Revelation chapter 12 and verse 6, because it says, Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. See, Revelation 11 and verse 3 is connected to Revelation 12 and verse 6. So notice the elements of verse 6. You have a woman, flees to the wilderness, has a place prepared, God feeds her, 1,260 days. Now let's notice Revelation 12, verses 13 and 14. Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child, but the woman, same as we read in verse 6, the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness. We saw that in verse 6. To her place, we saw that in verse 6, where she is nourished. God fed her according to verse 6. But now the time period has changed. For a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So 1,260 days in verse 6 is the same as time, times, and dividing of time in Revelation 12, verses 13 and 14. And of course, this connects with Daniel chapter 7, verse 25. We read again, He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. So what can we conclude? We can safely reach the conclusion that the 3.5 times, the time times dividing of time, the 1,260 days, and the 42 months, and the times of the Gentiles are all parallel expressions. A careful study of these prophecies indicates clearly that their fulfillment took place during a 1,260-year period after the Roman Empire disintegrated. So it can't refer to the destruction of literal Jerusalem. This means, folks, that Jerusalem spoken of in Luke 21 and verse 24 is not literal Jerusalem, but rather spiritual Jerusalem, because literal Jerusalem had already been destroyed in the year 70. Albert Barnes, the great Presbyterian Bible commentator from many, many years ago, wrote a very interesting comment on the 42 months that we find in Revelation 11 and also in Luke 21 and verse 24. I read, the 42 months would embrace the whole period of the ascendancy and prevalence of the papacy, or the whole time of the continuance of that corrupt domination in which Christendom was to be trodden down and corrupted by it. Now that's very important. Albert Barnes was not a Seventh-day Adventist, but he captures what this is talking about when it refers to the host being trampled upon for 42 months. Once again, the 42 months would embrace the whole period of the ascendancy and prevalence of the papacy, or the whole time of the continuance of that corrupt domination in which Christendom, so he interprets Jerusalem as Christendom, to be trodden down and corrupted by it. So the Gentiles would be the papacy, the persecutors of God's church. He continues, thus regarded, this would properly express the time of the ascendancy of the papal power. And the end of the 42 months, or 1,260 years, would denote the time when the influence of that power would cease. In other words, the times of the Gentiles come to an end when the papacy received its mortal wound at the end of the 1,260 years in the year 1798. So the period of papal dominion was from 538 to 1798. This is the times of the Gentiles. This is time times the dividing of time. This is 1,260 days. This is the 42 months. So let's summarize these time periods as they are found in Scripture. The times of the Gentiles in Luke 21 and verse 24, the last half of the verse. 42 months, Revelation 11 verse 2. 1,260 days, Revelation 11 verse 3. Again, 1,260 days, Revelation 12 verse 6. 42 months, Revelation 13 verse 5. Time times the dividing of time, Revelation chapter 12 and verse 14. 3.5 times, or time times the dividing of time, Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25. I hope you're understanding what we're covering, folks. This is extremely significant. Basically what it means is Jerusalem in the second half of Luke 21 and verse 24 is referring not to literal Jerusalem. Jerusalem represents the Christian church, whereas the Gentiles represent the Roman Catholic papacy. And the times of the Gentiles, the period is from 538 to 1798, the period of the papal dominion. So we have reached the conclusion that the two halves of Luke 21 and verse 24 describe two distinct tramplings of two distinct Jerusalems by two distinct groups of Gentiles. The first half of Luke 21 verse 24 describes literal Jerusalem trampled by the literal Romans in the year 70 AD. The second half of Luke 21 verse 24 describes the trampling of spiritual Jerusalem, the church, by spiritual Rome, that is, the papacy, from 538 to 1798. Thus, Revelation 11, 2 and 3 expands upon the second half of Luke 21 and verse 24. Let us take now a few moments to focus on the sign of the destruction of Jerusalem, of literal Jerusalem, as we find it in Daniel chapter 9 and verses 26 and 27. Daniel 9, 26 and 27. This is predicting the destruction of literal Jerusalem. And this prophecy actually begins in the year 457 BC, the prophecy of the 70 weeks, takes us all the way till the year 34 AD. I'm going to read now the section that deals with the last week of the 70 weeks. This is the time when Jesus was on earth, when he was anointed the Messiah, when he was baptized, up to the time of his death, and then to the time when Stephen was stoned, which is the year 34 AD. So let's read Daniel 9, 26 and 27. After the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off. That is, sometime after the 62 and the 7 weeks, if you look in the previous verse. In other words, after 69 weeks, when the last week is beginning, it says that the Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself. Jesus didn't die for himself. And the prince of the people who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. This is speaking about the destruction of the literal city of Jerusalem. Now the question is, who are the people of the prince who is to come that are going to destroy the city and the sanctuary? You know, many think that the people of the prince are the Roman legions that come and destroy the city. There are three ways of looking at this. If you read the parable that is given in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 1 to 14, it says that God destroyed the city of Jerusalem. He used his armies, which are the Roman legions. But also, there's evidence that the Jews themselves destroyed their own city by rejecting the Messiah. We read that in Luke chapter 19, verses 41 to 44. They did not know the hour of their visitation. That's why Jesus spoke about the destruction of the city and the temple. So the people of the prince, are the Jews, and the prince is Jesus, and they destroy their own city by rejecting the Messiah. So once again, after 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. And till the end of the war, desolations are determined. That's a key word, remember? Desolation, the abomination of desolation. Verse 27, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. This is the Messiah who's doing this. But in the middle of the week, that's the year 31 AD, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And now notice what would be the result of bringing an end to sacrifice and offering. It says, and on the wing of abominations. See, there you have the key word of Matthew 21 and Matthew 24 and verse 15. And you look at the parallel passage in Luke 21, verses 20 and 21. It speaks about Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. So it says, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. Abomination and desolate. This is the prophecy that Jesus spoke about in Matthew 24 and verse 15. Even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate. So Daniel had already prophesied the abomination of desolation. Because of the rejection of the Messiah, who was anointed at the beginning of the last week, who was cut off in the middle of the last week, because the Jewish nation rejected him as the Messiah, we are told twice in this passage that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. You would see the abomination of desolation that Jesus spoke about in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15. However, there is going to be a final abomination of desolation, as we've already studied. Let's go in our Bibles to Revelation chapter 17. Revelation chapter 17, and we'll read beginning at verse 1. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 1. And we're going to focus especially on verses 4 through 6 and 15 and 16, but I also want to read chapter 17 and verses 1 to 3. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of the names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And then notice the characteristics of this woman. It's a harlot woman, by the way. We're told clearly in verse 1, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot. A woman represents a church. A pure woman, a pure church. A harlot woman represents an apostate church, a church that has lost its way. Verse 4, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of the, now notice this, key word, full of abominations. We've already studied this in a previous lecture. The wine of her abominations includes especially the change in God's holy law, from worshiping on Sabbath to worshiping on Sunday, substituting human legislation in place of divine legislation. So it says here, and in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. If she's a mother, she must have daughters that were born of her after some time. Verse 6, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. So this harlot is going to have a second period of dominion. Just like we noticed in Matthew chapter 24, that you have 2 tribulation periods, because you have the papacy ruling in the past, and the papacy also ruling in the future after a period of pause in between. We are now in that pause period in between. It's like I've mentioned before. You put a DVD in the DVD player, you're going to watch a movie, you press play, the movie advances, say for about a half an hour, then you have something else to do, you push pause, you leave, you come back later, you push play, and it picks up where you left off. but there's a pause period in between. We are now in the pause period between the past tribulation by the papacy and the future tribulation by the same power. It's one tribulation with a pause in between. Now let's go to verses 15 and 16 of Revelation chapter 17. We've already noticed that this harlot is full of abominations, and she has daughters that do her bidding. But now I want you to notice the word desolation. It says in verse 15, it speaks about what the woman is sitting on, many waters. What do the many waters represent? It says, "Then he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues." The act of sitting means that this harlot rules over the nations. But what is going to happen to this harlot and also to her daughters, which we will study in another presentation? What is going to happen? It says in verse 16, the very next verse, "And the 10 horns," these are 10 kings or kingdoms, "and the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her," here's the key word, "desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire." So you'll notice here that Matthew chapter 24 focuses primarily on the destruction of Jerusalem and the end time events that lead to the final destruction of the world. However, Luke gives us a glimpse not only into the destruction of Jerusalem, it gives us, and also the events that will lead to the destruction of the world, but it also provides us a clear presentation on the period between the destruction of Jerusalem and what will occur during the end time. And so this is the reason why, as I mentioned in our initial presentation in this series, that we need to look at the testimony of all 3 Gospels. It's not enough just to study Matthew chapter 24. We have to study Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke chapter 21, because each provides details that the other doesn't. And of course, as you've noticed, we also need to compare Revelation chapter 11. We need to go to Revelation chapter 12. We need to go to Revelation chapter 13. We need to go back to Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8. All of these passages are describing the same period, the period of papal dominion from 538 to 1798, when primarily in Europe the papacy ruled with an iron hand. And as I've mentioned, Revelation chapter 13 verse 3 tells us that the deadly wound of this system is going to be healed, and by the way, it is rapidly healing, and when it does heal, we will have the second stage of the tribulation, of which we will speak about a little bit later in this series.